Hello and welcome to the RackForms installation guide. So by default, RackForms ships with two licenses, which means that we can install the editor to two different servers/domains. Because the forms that we create work on any domain, two domains is, for most users, more than enough. You can install it to, as we will in our case, something like demo.rackforms.com, and you create forms for any website that you want. However, one of the most common things that most of our users will do because they have two licenses is install locally and install on their live web server. And this is a really handy way of working because then you can transfer jobs between those two servers by saving out job files. And so instead of just showing how we install to a web server, we're going to show how we install locally as well. Now, it's important to note that there is a dedicated page dedicated to installing on a virtual host, and we're going to go pretty quickly through those particular steps because I don't want to duplicate too much information. If you're interested in learning about the actual process of installing to a virtual host, we have very good documentation on that, and there's a link right below this video where that is found. But like I say, we are going to show it here so that maybe seeing that process twice will help it along. So first things first, we're going to install to a live web server. Now, the live web server, of course, the first thing that we always do is figure out what we want to use for our hosting company. I prefer GoDaddy, so I use for all of my hosting, simply because I think they have some of the best support in terms of giving you a web server that has a lot of features that you might want to use for something like RackForms. So the ability to set up multiple databases, customize your PHP configuration, etc. It's a really great hosting provider. I know not everybody is going to feel the same way, but that's personally who I always use is GoDaddy. So we're going to be specific to GoDaddy in this video, though the process that you see in this video can of course be applied to any other hosting company. And if there's a difference between what may be GoDaddy specific and not, I'll try to point that out as we go along. So that said then, what we're looking at here is my hosting control panel for demo.rackforms.com. This is where I'm going to install RackForms today. When I first log into my cPanel, this is the interface that I'm greeted with. And what it's really showing us here, just so you can relate this to possibly your hosting company if it differs, are all the areas that I can control my hosting account. So I have preferences. I have my domain information, databases, we'll be looking at that shortly, our file manager, etc. So this is just the high-level view of where we manage everything in a GoDaddy hosting account. This is collectively known as cPanel. So if you ever hear somebody talking about cPanel, this is simply a brand of software that allows us to talk to a hosting package. So first things first, and when I have an account like this, that essentially needs to get RackForms installed to it, the first thing I want to do is install, or I should say upload the files that go for this installation. So I actually have 3 files that relate to that. I have my rackforms.zip file, which I've gotten for the download site. This is our actual software. I have a user.ini file. This is specific to GoDaddy. This allows us to configure some properties of our GoDaddy installation. And then I have a robots.txt file. And this is usually for, I don't want to necessarily call it SEO, but for managing what a search engine can see of your site. A lot of times, if you're installing RackForms, you really don't want or essentially need a search engine to see your forms. So we can use robots.txt to essentially block a search engine from seeing that, because you certainly don't want to, kind of confuse them. So first things first, I probably want to get those files uploaded. So in GoDaddy cPanel, I can either click here under File Manager, or I can scroll down and click File Manager right here. One of the questions that it asks us when we first open it up is where we want to go. The default is web root. I'm going to leave that there. And then it's also going to ask us an option here if we want to show hidden files. We actually do want to show that. Not because RackForms actually needs that, but because our user.ini file needs that. So I'm going to go ahead and click Go. We're now greeted with our basically a view out of our file system. And actually, let me get rid of my links here so I give us a little bit more room. Basically, these files are what already exists on a bone stock installation of your web hosting client. So in order to add files, I'm going to click Upload. And very importantly, I'm going to, under my permissions here, I'm going to make sure that group has right permissions. Now, this is actually a really important part. Basically, when we build a form in GoDaddy, or excuse me, in RackForms, we need to write to the file system because we're actually creating files and then writing those files to the file system. And so it's important that we have the ability to write to the web server. And as far as GoDaddy is concerned, it simply wants group to have right permissions. So you'll notice by default, it didn't have that checked, so I just made sure that was checked right here. In other words, the permissions are now 664. This is not going to be the case with every web server that you have. Sometimes you can leave the permissions at 644. And it would be just fine. For our cases, though, whenever you're using GoDaddy, always make sure we have this. With that selected now I'll go in and I'm going to select the files that I want to upload. So I have here on my desktop the files that I want. So here's that rackforms.zip file. So I'm going to go ahead and start uploading that right now. The file itself is about 17 megabytes. So depending on your internet connection, it may take up to a couple minutes to do it. We have a fairly decent connection here, so I'm doing about a quarter of a megasecond. So hopefully this won't take too long to do. With that file done, we want to get our two final files, our user.ini and robots.txt. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. So user.ini is, as I mentioned at the top video, it's one of those things about GoDaddy that I really, really love, which is that instead of locking your PHP down, GoDaddy actually gives you the ability to change it, to actually modify things about your PHP settings so that you can make it work for you. And this can be good for security. It can also be good for a lot of other reasons. In this particular case, essentially what we're doing here is we're telling through this file right here to turn off some potentially dangerous things, so allow URLF open, so we don't want remote file uploads. We want output buffering on. This is great for PDF creation, something that RackForms supports. We turn Magic Quotes GPC off, again, for security. We set our time zone to America Phoenix. Because the server is located in Phoenix, this is going to ensure that whenever we get a form submission, its timestamp will be correct. We want to turn display errors off because we don't want any potentially sensitive information being shown. We do a few settings for file uploads, and we also set a memory limit right here. So all of these settings are not necessarily needed for RackForms to run, but they make your server more secure and they make RackForms run better. And so that's why we like them. So we're going to go ahead and upload that file. So that's that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to browse and I'm going to, again, just select that file and upload it. And then finally, I'm going to upload that robots.txt file. Now, in this case, my robots.txt is simply blocking everything from the web server. And I'm only doing that because this is just a demo server, and I don't want any search engine to do anything with this information. I just want them to ignore this. In most cases, what we'd actually have is something like disallow and then the path to RackForms. So /RackForms, for example. But here, I'm just going to say, I don't want the search engine to see anything on my site. So click OK. So now we have those three files uploaded. So I'm going to go ahead and click go back here, and I should now have rackforms.zip, robots.txt, and user.ini. Now here's the important thing. In order for cPanel to actually use this file right here, I actually have to rename it to .user.ini. And as you may recall, this is why we check that show hidden files option, because whenever I make something dot and then some text in Linux, it's actually going to say that's a hidden file. On Windows, you don't have this problem. Windows, you can have a file named dot something and it'll still show in your Windows Explorer. Unfortunately, on Mac and Linux/Unix systems, that isn't the case. You have to make sure that you're showing hidden files. So that's why we've done that. And so now you can see here that I can still see that file. If I did that option check, if I did not have that option checked, this file would now be invisible, which is really confusing. The robots.txt file we'll leave alone, but we do want to unzip this file. So quick note about this. Because we have FTP access on our server here, it is conceivable that I could have unzipped this file first, right? Just taken this and unzipped it and then uploaded all the files separately. The problem with that is that will almost certainly fail. Generally speaking, whenever we FTP something, we always want to upload the rackforms.zip file and then use the extract system on your hosting control panel to actually extract the files. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to say rackforms.zip. Let's extract that. It asks me where I want to put it. In this case, I don't need to change anything. I'll just simply say extract files. When it's done, it's now created a folder called RackForms. So that's exactly what we want. Usually with the zip file, I delete it then. And we're now left with RackForms and then our .user.ini and robots.txt. So at this point now, I'm essentially, with the exception of one last step at the end, I'm essentially done working with the file manager. If I actually look at my RackForms folder right here, you'll notice I have an index.php file by default. And again, another reason why we love GoDaddy, it'll automatically serve that file. And because RackForms hasn't been installed yet, it'll take us to the installer. We can actually try that. So for example, if I go to demo.rackforms.com and I say RackForms, because that's the folder that we're in. Let me type that in right. It's going to, again, load that index page up. It'll see that we're not installed. It'll automatically take us to install.php. If you ever have a situation where this doesn't come up, you can just always type it in by hand. In other words, go to your domain. Recall that we've put this in a folder called RackForms. So then our path would be /RackForms, and then type in /install.php, and that'll take it to the installer. Okay, so how do we actually run the installer? Well, basically, there are two main areas to the installer that we're concerned with. The first is the database information, and the second is our own user information. Now, for the sake of security, I've actually, you're not going to see all of the values that I have right here, but basically what I've done is I've written down ahead of time some values that I can use for these four fields, right? The database name, the username, the password. And excuse me, I don't need to change this, just these three fields right here, the name, username, and password. But we do actually need to change those, or I should say create those right now. So I'm going to keep my installer page open right here. I'm going to go back into cPanel, and I'm going to launch the MySQL database wizard. Now again, this is GoDaddy. Every hosting plan differs a little bit, but for our purposes, we want to use the database wizard. Hopefully your hosting plan has something similar. What essentially is going to do here is it's going to say, let's create a new database, let's create a user, and then assign that user to that database. So as far as the database, again, I've pre-written this down, so you'll see I have a database called dbrfdemo right here. So I'll click next. Now it's going to ask me for a username. Again, I've created this ahead of time, so I'm just going to paste it in. And then finally, it's going to ask me for a password. What's really important about this step right here is that these values that I just pasted in are exactly what the installer wants. In other words, it wants the database name, which remember we pasted that in before, and I can actually paste these values in right here. So remember, this is the database name. Then I had that user name, and then I have the password. So these three values now are essentially exactly what I'm typing in right here. So I'll say create user back in cPanel. And then finally, I'm going to assign some privileges to this user. Now, generally speaking, when we're creating databases, we want to assign as few privileges as possible for something to do its job. And in this particular case, I want to be able to create databases, delete them, index them, select them, possibly run triggers. I want to be able to alter and create routines, drop views and create views. I want to be able to execute, insert, show view, and update. In other words, we're essentially including everything here, but I don't really need to alter anything, generally speaking, though I will check that just to be sure. And I really don't need these here, create temporary tables. If you really want to be safe, you can simply say all privileges. And if you ever run into any problems, potentially with a security admin saying that maybe they don't want those privileges, you can always dial back privileges and then check to make sure everything works. But generally speaking, that first set are the things that we need. Select, insert, delete, etc. So I'll go ahead and click next step. And what essentially this is going to do now is this is going to create a database with the properties that I already specified. So I'll just click return home. So now we have a database as we're pointing to right here. The last thing that we do now is simply create a user in RackForms. So I'm going to say test for the username and the password. And maybe for email, I just put in my email. So final notes before I hit install right here. So the first thing is database host. You notice that by default, it put in the value localhost. And in almost all cPanel installations, that's what it'll be. It'll be localhost. But there are cases in some hosting plans, particularly with other shared hosting plans, where this host value is going to be different. And you'll notice we have a little tooltip here. If I mouse over this, you'll see that indeed we have some hints right here. If you have a problem with the host value, either email us, and we'll go ahead and help you find that, or contact your hosting provider to ask them what that value is going to be. Generally speaking, though, again, with cPanel, another reason why we like it is it's just localhost, and that's in fact our default value. Finally, there are a few other smaller, or I should say less important settings right here for most default installations. We're always going to have the database port at 3306, so we can usually leave that alone. And then indeed the MySQL socket path is usually guessed by the installer, so again we can ignore this. If I could put it one way, I would say usually the values in red are the only ones that we actually need to worry about. And that's essentially the ones that we filled out or at least checked right here. I should mention lastly though that this database vendor right here can actually be changed. Usually if we have PHP running on a Linux box, as we do right here, usually just leaving this at MySQL will work, though we could certainly choose PDO as our database vendor. Or if we're actually installing to MS SQL, which we actually have a video on that as well, that is a Microsoft server, we can select MS SQL from this list as well. But at this point, we should be good to go here. And I know I've been kind of talking a lot here, but just to really quickly review, we basically uploaded our files. We went through the database tool, and we created a database and a database user. And then we simply copy and paste those values into the installer. Finally, I then created a user that will log into RackForms with. In this case, it's very simple, just test and test. And I put in my email. So at this point, we should be good to go. So I'm going to hit install right here. RackForms is going to go through the install process. And if all went well, that is, it can communicate with the database and our file permissions were right, we'll get this message right here. Your RackForms installation is complete. There's one last step that we have to do. I mentioned this before. We now have to delete the install.php file. So that's not a hard and fast rule. We don't actually have to delete it. One trick that I actually like to use is instead of deleting it, I actually just rename it to .old. The reason why I do that is .old isn't a file extension that is recognized by Apache, so it actually can't serve this file, but at least we still have a copy of it if we ever need it again, right? So if, for example, I wanted to run the installer again on this box, maybe to wipe everything or reset my master account password, all I have to do is just rename this guy and it's right there. I don't have to worry about unzipping and uploading again. And so at this point then, now that we've deleted, in this case renamed, the install.php file, I click here and we're taken to login, and we can now go ahead and log in. So that is the installation process on a Linux server. The last thing I want to take a look at is doing the exact same thing but to a local server, so a localhost. The localhost setup is a little bit more involved, and again, there is specific documentation for this, very specific documentation actually, on our documentation site. And again, there's a link to that underneath this video. But hopefully I can do it here by memory, just to show you real quickly kind of the broad strokes how it's done. So the first thing that we need to do is we essentially need to tell our local machine that it has a web address that we can point our browser to. So I'm actually just going to quit Firefox here, and you'll see why in just a moment. Now I'm on a Mac right here, so I actually have some notes jotted down here on where some of my important files are. In this particular case, I need to set up a vhost file to say that demo.rackforms.com is not actually a site on the internet, but it's a local site. And the reason why is because we're actually going to point that to this folder right here that I'm going to create. Actually, create a new folder. So essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rename this to demo.rackforms.com.1. I'm actually going to create a new folder. That's essentially that old name. So let me paste that in, demo.rackforms.com. So essentially what I want to do is I want my local web server to say whenever somebody types in demo.rackforms.com into the URL bar, not to go out to the internet to get it, but to actually find it locally. And so there's two things I have to do to make that work. The first is I need to create a virtual host on Apache. And looking at my notes right here, I can see that my vhost file is located at etc Apache 2 extra. So I have a nano command right here to change that file. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in, type my password. And then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of this file. And I'm basically just going to take this block right here. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it and then just change the values so that they match my local setup right here. So in this particular case, I know that this is in users, and I may actually have to guess this a little bit. Let me actually scroll up here. Let me actually just copy this, because why get all crazy? We basically just need to say that our document root is in fact this folder. So demo.rackforms.com. You notice that we don't leave a trailing slash at that. We just have the folder name. Finally, I need to put in the address for this. So in this case, I need to say the server name is demo.rackforms.com as well. Finally, I usually set up a custom error log for each one of these, so I'm going to do that right now. This makes troubleshooting much, much easier if something comes up. So that's now my Apache configuration for this. I'm going to hit X and Y to save that. So basically now Apache has been told that if it gets a request for demo.rackforms.com, it knows where to point the web browser, right? It knows to point it to this folder right here. Now there's one other file that I need to change, and that is our host file. So I'm going to say sudo nano hosts, and that's in etc. So sudo nano etc hosts. Now this file actually tells us at the OS level that if I type in demo.rackforms.com, it is actually served by 127.0.0.1, which is in fact our local loopback address. So in other words, if I type in RackForms, demo.rackforms.com, it is served by 127.0.0.1. Of course, if I ever go to 127.0.0.1, and by the way, this is the same on Windows, Mac, Linux, etc., this is simply my local web server, right? So in this case, I have a local version of rackforms.com. So I'm going to save that, X and Y to save. Now I'm going to need to restart Apache because I need our vhost change to take hold. So I'm going to be lazy and just copy and paste this. And now Apache has been restarted. So now I should be able to say ping demo.rackforms.com. And it should just be our local address, which it is. This also means that if I launch Firefox and say demo.rackforms.com, it should now hopefully go to our local loopback address. Now, the reason why I quit Firefox before was that a web browser actually needs to be restarted for this change to take place. And strangely enough, I need to clear my cache here. It doesn't look like, okay, there we go. It doesn't look like that change took place right away, so I actually had to clear my cache. And I did that by hitting Shift Command and Delete. I should actually show you. I got this, and I said clear now. So this is good. So now it actually says we don't have permissions to access this on our server. So that's okay. What we basically want to do is populate our folder now with the files for RackForms. So I'm actually going to take all of our files right here. I'm just going to drag them in. In other words, kind of doing that same step that I did with the file manager in GoDaddy, but just doing it locally now, right? I'm just unzipping all these files. So now hopefully I will get my installer again. At this point now, it's really just a case of performing the exact same steps that we did before. So in the last, or I should say in the first instances, we had to use our MySQL wizard to do this. Because I'm on a Mac, would probably use something like, in this case, SQL Pro to actually create a database called, let's say in this case, test. I could do it that way. I could also use many of the other free programs that are available. So there's MySQL Workbench. So this is available on all platforms, and this simply allows us to manage a database this way. But the point is, we had the wizard to do that for us before in our hosting account. Now we essentially need to do it by hand. In other words, I need to be able to create a database. In this case, I have one called test. I would then look at my users, and I create a user, maybe in this case, RackForms, that has access to that, and then essentially do the exact same thing. So I would say the database is test. The user is RackForms, and in this case, it's test for the password. The username might be test and test again, and let's say info@rackforms.com. And so, again, the exact same process, but now we're just using the different values that are local to my database. And again, I used, in this case, test for my database. Again, we can see that right here. I have a database called test, and then I have my username of RackForms because RackForms has access to the test database, and all my other values are set. So now I'm going to go ahead and click install, and it's going to do the exact same thing it did before. So I'm going to get a message here. It says our installation is complete, and I can once again perform that same step. I'm going to go into my install file. Now, because this is Mac OS, it's going to complain a little bit if I try to rename this to old, so I'm just going to call this install-1 in this case. Mainly because it's a local installation and nobody from the outside world can get at this, I really don't care if this file is still available as a PHP file. And once again, I'll click here, and now I can run this site. So that's basically it. Again, a lot of little points here that we mentioned, but the main idea that you just saw right there when I did our local installation, really the point is that this can go very, very quickly when we step through the process. It's really just about creating that database, getting our files uploaded, and then running the installer. As always, though, we do have custom installation support. If you ever find that you're not able to get RackForms installed, or you just have general questions, let us know at info@rackforms.com. We'll be happy to perform the first installation for you for free. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let us know, info@rackforms.com. And thanks for watching.